Okay, great. Sorry, I just had a couple little technical difficulties. But good evening and welcome everyone to Writing Grants for Faith-Based Organizations. My name is Brendan Hunter. I'm a program director at the Episcopal Church Foundation. So glad you've taken the time out of your busy schedules to join us this evening. Good evening and welcome everyone to Writing Grants for Faith-Based Organizations. My name is Brendan Hunter. I'm a program director at the Episcopal. All right. Sorry about that. Always fun with technology. Anyways, let's start that again. My name is Brendan Hunter. I'm a program director for leadership resources at the Episcopal Church Foundation. Joining us is joining me on my left, I guess perhaps on your right, is Reverend Daniel Velez Rivera, our presenter for this evening. But before we get started, just want to give a quick introduction to the Episcopal Church Foundation for those of you who may not be familiar with us. We were established in 1949 and are a lay-led independent organization. Our mission is to strengthen the strategic, leadership, and financial capabilities of Episcopal dioceses, congregations, and other organizations such as religious orders, camps and conference centers, etc. We do this through a variety of programs, including capital campaigns, planned giving, endowments, strategic solutions, a variety of leadership programs, including ECF Auto Practices, which I hope you subscribe to, which includes vestry papers, the Fellowship Partners Program. If you haven't already, please do check out our website, episcopalfoundation.org. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Daniel.
Good evening. Thank you, Brendan. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in this evening to the webinar. My name is Daniel Velez Rivera, and I am the vicar of St. Gabriel's Church in Leesburg, Virginia. That is about an hour and 15 minutes west of DC. St. Gabriel's is presently a dual language congregation. It's English and Spanish language services. I'm the vicar of both language communities. St. Gabriel's was founded about 15 years ago. We are a church that doesn't have a church building, but we worship in a school in our English language service and at another Episcopal church in Leesburg for our Spanish language service. One of the sort of titles or envelopes or stamps that people categorize the ministry that I do is as a church planter, and then someone came up with the concept of congregational redeveloper. It's like, okay, I'll throw myself in that hat too. And so St. Gabriel's actually represents both of those. It had been founded by another planter, and it came into a redevelopment stage when I came on board. And with that redevelopment, we started a Latino ministry. So I've been ordained for about 11 years, and I've always started Latino ministries in English language churches, Episcopal churches, and this is my third gig, if you may. I've always had to sustain my ministry with external funding sources. And so the external funding sources initially, when I first was ordained, was to start a Latino ministry. It was an experiment that the Diocese of Massachusetts had, a 3-year experiment that was called an urban intern or urban resident. And the goal was to attempt to start a Latino ministry, which we did successfully. After the 3 years was done, we moved the whole ministry that had formed in that 3 years to an Episcopal church in town that was sort of dying. They were glad to have us. That meant that while the bishop and the diocese paid for my salary, I had to come up with all the operational and programmatic funds to do mission and ministry. And so that is how I came to start writing grants. Sort of thrown into the deep end of the pool. I think you will experiment, you will explore as you do, as you start figuring out how am I going to do this, that the best way to write a grant is to write a grant. And so it is probably wise to start small so that you can have a contained and not like 2-month process in writing a grant. Start something small. It takes a little bit of time, but it gets your wheels rolling and spinning on the concept of writing grants. And we'll talk a little bit about, sort of logistics and process in a little while. But I want to start right now with sort of foundation work. And foundation work requires, it's really, it's really basic. The first thing you need to do is observe and listen. And what are you observing and who are you listening to? If you want to start any kind of program or ministry in a church, you have to observe what isn't there and what is there in terms of ministry, program, or mission, and then do a lot of listening. And the listening comes from the people in the pews, your networks in the community. You have to look outside your own doors to see who else is doing what I think we need to do in our church. The fact of the matter is that if you have this great desire to do X, Y, or Z program in your congregation, and there's either a social services agency or a church nearby that's already doing it, why would you want to start your own thing and not just join them? And so I would encourage you to do that foundational research, talk to a lot of people, talk to your neighbors, talk to the neighboring churches or neighboring organizations. When I say neighboring organizations, all of those community organizations in town that serve people. We all are sharing in our context the same constituents. And so why not go to people that may already be doing the work? After you've identified sort of your project, your program, and you have that in your mind and you're thinking, I want to implement something, it's a wise idea to talk to, people in your team, if you have a team, on the dimension that you want to start the project or program with. That will start giving you an idea of a budget. Yes, we have to pray a lot in order to do God's work. And we also have to run these programs and these projects with the business mind as well as our sacred mind. Because the people that you are going to be requesting funding from will be looking at you as they look at any other business that they want to fund. And so there are different phases in your project and program, and you should just write them out. Use a pad and paper. Keep good notes. Let's talk about, for a minute now, the different types of funding that you might be looking at while you're out there. I would say that there's the local funding sources, regional funding sources, national funding sources, and maybe international. Before you even talk to anyone, I'm going to start with diocesan resources. Before you start writing let's call it a plan on who to approach, you need to have your purpose written down and clear in your mind. Clarity of purpose is critical. I already told you that you should go observe and listen and see who else out there might be doing something similar. A funder will ask you, who are you working with? And if you don't have an answer, and maybe there is no one that you will be working with, you need to justify that. Say, I've done research in these 20 organizations, 5 organizations, 10 organizations. No one is doing what we're doing, or someone is doing something similar, or 5 towns over, they're doing what I want to do here. That's 35 miles away, and I've already talked to the person who's directing that program. All of that indicates to a funder that you know what you're doing, that you've done some research, and they always want to know that. So make sure your purpose is clear. And when I ask myself the question is, why is my project, why is my program necessary to the community that I serve? Not necessary for maybe your congregation, if this is going to be a community program or serving the community that you're in. So be clear in your purpose. Who is it that I'm serving, and why is this important? I would add a word of caution to grant writers. Don't write a grant to expand the operational budget of your church. Write a grant that's going to serve others. Usually the grant that you're writing will have no impact on the bottom line of your church. It will be used specifically and directed for this project program that you're working on. You could even think, well, if I'm going to do youth ministry, clearly that will hit, our budget. Well, yeah, you're going to have revenues, but you're going to have expenses. There's not really going to be money that's going to be left over to pay the parish administrator. That's really shouldn't be the function of the type of grant that you're writing if it is for program, if it is for mission work. You might be writing a grant for operations, and that would be separate from the conversation that we're having today. So discuss with, I would say, at least one other disciple. Jesus sent us out 2 and 2. Don't do this on your own. So discuss with at least one other person that will be working with you the who, the what, the where, the why, the when, and the how. It should be a small team of people. It could be one person. It could be 2 people. And make sure that people are clear and that are testing you, that they're testing you to make sure that you understand your purpose. I would ask you also to spend time on sort of your vision of the project or of the program, and emphasize, as I just said earlier, who needs it and why you should provide it. Some grants are written to prove a concept, and those are called pilot grants. Pilot grants typically will require, depending on what you're doing, a small amount of money. And the purpose, in my experience from writing a pilot grant, is so that within maybe 9 to 15, 16 months, I could write a larger grant and then have a proof of concept. Had this idea a year ago, started working on it, have done this, X, Y, Z, and now we're at a phase where we'd like to expand that, and it's going to cost A, B, C, D to do it. That's where your budget will come in. And we will talk about a narrative budget later on in our conversation. Research. After you've done some purpose work and vision work, you have to do the research, which is the community sort of feet on the street. Contact people for an informational interview. The people that you're going to serve, or a subset of them, or colleagues or organizations in the community that serve the same constituents. You want to ask whether you or have a feel for whether the program you are intending to offer, makes sense in the community. I would emphasize making phone calls, exploring, ask what their goals are, figure out how they might be different from what you envision, and make sure that that you're clear if there are distinctions, what all of the distinctions are. And there's a reason for that. You will be writing that into your grant. Even if it's a grant that's a one-pager, you should have a paragraph that says why you're different from anyone else offering a program in your community for constituents in the same community. You don't want to reinvent the wheel. So if there are, and I'm going to use churches as the example, if you have churches in your community that have, and I'll just use random, let's use a food pantry. Well, maybe you need 10 food pantries in your community, but do you need 15? Do you need 12? Do you need 11? That's the research, the type of research that I'm asking you to do. I would ask you, when you make the phone calls to partner organizations, ask them if they have a grant writer. Ask them whether they would be willing to share that resource. Sometimes you have to pay for that instead of writing a grant yourself. Because if they have a resource already, a grant writer, and you could tap into their program to help them expand it, it might behoove both them to say, yeah, use our resource and let's merge our programs, let's work together. Don't be shy to ask for support. I would ask another organization for a copy of their grant proposal, like I've offered, like I've given to you. I like to, when I write my grants, I'm more than willing to give it to other people so they have an idea of, in the case of the grant that I sent you, it's a very large grant. It was a Mission Enterprise Zone grant that the Episcopal Church has. That was a 22-page grant. It took about 3 months to write. The budget had like probably 5 or 6 iterations, so all of that was time consuming. And that type of grant requires that you go and, you know, you have to have bishop signatures, partner signatures, vestry signatures. All that stuff takes time. So when I say 3 months, it's the amount of time that it will take to gather all of the little particulars that you need to submit a grant. I would say that even the smallest grant, you know, should never be written the night before. If there's a deadline, make sure that you have another set of eyes that's going to look at what you've written, so that your language is understandable, but by someone who doesn't know very much about the program or project that you are writing about. Because the people that read grants might have no concept about what you're doing, but they definitely need to understand what you intend to do. I want to go back to a minute. You might say, well, I don't want someone else to write my grant. I want to write it. Even if you have an outside grant writer, someone that might want to do it for free, half the work of a grant will still need to be done by you, because you understand the context and the project and the program that you want to be offering. So it's not like you're handing things off to someone and you just sit back and wait. So be aware of that. Even if it's someone that volunteers to do your grant writing, will require a lot of your time. Any questions before I continue? We're going to go into conversations about granting sources, and I've asked Brendan to get the questions that you are typing out in the chat room and ask them to me. So if there are any questions, I can take those now.
So a reminder to everyone that you can open up the chat box if you're on Zoom by going to the upper left-hand side of your screen and pressing the chat button if you haven't done so already. And please do take advantage of the chat throughout this entire webinar. As Daniel said, I am monitoring the chat box for your questions, so even if he isn't able to get around to them immediately, I will flag them for later. If you are joining us on Facebook Live, please feel welcome to also use the comments below to ask your questions, and I will relay them over to Daniel as well. So those of you on Facebook Live are also welcome to add your questions and comments.
And I'll give folks a couple of seconds to, type out your questions before moving on.
And while we're waiting, Daniel, perhaps what might be helpful for some of our participants, especially those who are newer to the grant making process, what do you think is sort of like, if you could name the one thing that people get tripped up with initially when they're trying to do a grant that they sort of miss and should notice when engaging in this process that you would really want to highlight for people?
I'm going to use the metaphor of exam taking. When you're given a essay exam, it's a question that you're asked to answer, or a multiple part question. Many people trip up on not answering the question. Many people go, instead of answering the question, go around in circles, filling a page. These days, if they're online grants, there's a limit of words or sometimes even characters that you can use. And so one of the very, very, very important things to do is type out your responses, on Word, if this is an online electronic source, but be very conscious of answering the question. Sometimes also people answer more, give more information. This would be the legal metaphor. If I didn't ask you this question, you don't necessarily have to give me answers that you think might be helpful in them determining you as a good candidate. Stick to answering the question and focus on answering the question. Most grants will also give you in their guidelines what they fund and what they don't fund. It is critical that you that you're trying to sort of wedge in your agenda into into their grant process. They could read it and go, we don't fund that. Did they not read this? And then they'll just spit you out. They won't consider the rest of the grant. So be very, do your research well. Don't go to a foundation or a grantor just because it's available. Make sure that what they fund is what you are applying for.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. And we do have a couple of questions that have come in. Robin asks, is there one central resource for identifying faith-based grants in the Episcopal Church and in the wider community?
No, there isn't, but there are places to go. So I would start at my diocese. Not every diocese has a development person, but you could go to the diocesan treasurer, you could go to the canon to the ordinary, and you could go to your bishops. They know their budget. They have an annual budget just like your church does. And so if there are any endowed funds for a particular area, and you have already done your thinking and can explain sort of elevator speech of what you're hoping to do, and ask the question, does our diocese have any funding sources for this kind of project? They will be able to answer that because they're familiar with their budget. On the national level, I've given probably, I don't know if it was 6 or 7 different resources with the web links, different funding sources for different types of projects. For example, the Episcopal Church Women Granting Organizations don't only fund projects that are for women, they might be doing women and children. And that's just in the Episcopal Church. So I've given you some that I'm familiar with. And in addition, there are sometimes some diocesan grants that are particular only to a diocese for a particular purpose. And I'll use an example that I had in the Diocese of Massachusetts when I was there, and it was Church Home Society was the name of the diocesan fund, and it only funded, for the most part at that time, because these things change, programs for children and youth. And I had a after-school program that was open not only to my congregation but to the community, and they funded it nicely.
Great, thanks. And as I also put the link in as well if you want to check out those resources that Danny was referring to. Karen is asking, are there common grant components or specific language expected by most award agencies?
Ask that question again, please.
So are there common grant components or specific types of language expected by grantees?
So in the grant that I gave as a sample or to all of you, it's a very comprehensive grant application because that grant was a $100,000 grant, and so they wanted the whole kit and caboodle of information, and I chose that grant, and I've written, dozens and dozens of grants, and I've gotten probably $800,000 or $900,000 in funding over the last 11 years just by writing grants for my churches. You really, so I guess no, that you have to.
Great. Well, actually, that leads into another question that we had from Randy asking, wondering what was the smallest grant you ever received or the largest grant you ever received, and what's your batting average on grant writing, about 1 out of 10, etc. Kind of like give a ballpark idea on that.
So the smallest grant I've gotten is $1,000, and the largest grant I've gotten is $100,000. And I have written grants that are 1 page, just like a cover letter. And I've written, like, the sort of most comprehensive grant was a Mission Enterprise Zone grant, which came out to be 22 pages of information. The latter had a lot of demand for data to substantiate the ask. The language really has to come from your heart. If you are writing a grant that is mission focused, use scripture, tie in scripture to it, even if it's for a secular organization, because you are applying as a nonprofit that is religious. Put your prayerful language into a grant that is going to a church-based funding source. Because in the end, it not only is the technicality of what you're doing it for Jesus, and for the people of God. And so say that, use that language. Sometimes some grant writers tend to get really technical and forget, that our purpose as a people of faith is that we're doing this as the extension of our mission to God on God's behalf. So I would use that kind of language. Going back to the sort of question that you had earlier, sort of do's and don'ts, please answer the question. Make sure that you are really, that you're looking at that question, and if you don't understand what they're trying to say, call the grantor. You can always call the grantor. They appreciate that, actually, because then they know that you're trying to make sure that you're going to answer appropriately. There's always a phone number or an email address for grant funds. Call the grantor and make sure that you understand the question that they're asking. And you could even, tell them, I was hoping to answer this question X, Y, or Z. Is that what you expect from me? Same thing I would say with regard to your budget. Sometimes it's not clear what budget they're asking you for. I'll be specific about that. So we're St. Gabriel's Episcopal Church, and we have a budget for an annual budget for our church. We have that. I can send them that. But when they ask you for the budget, they're not only asking for the budget of the host organization, they need the budget for the specific program you are writing a grant for. That is a subset. That budget that you're sending for the program that you're applying money, that you're applying to write a grant for, might not be in your operational budget at all. So they need to know how much you're planning to receive and get specifically for the program that you're writing for, and they want to see what is the big picture of the organization that you are part of. In this case, it would be St. Gabriel's Episcopal Church.
Great, thanks. Well, I think that we can go ahead and move on to the next section.
Yes, okay. Granting sources. I started by saying they're local, regional, diocesan, and national, international granting sources. I will start by saying that there's money out there, folks. You need to use your networks. Before you ask, make sure you have a clear concept of your, written, your vision, your goals in mind. Every grant you find has guidelines, and those guidelines include a list of things that they fund and a list of things that they don't fund. If the list is vague and you are wondering, do I fit under this category? Whichever, I'm talking now with local, regional, diocesan, or national granting sources, call the contact person. I'm going to give you some things to think about with regard to local, regional funding sources. So I'm in Leesburg, Virginia. I'm really not a club person, but my senior warden when I came to Leesburg said, you should join Rotary Club because the movers and shakers are at the Rotary Club. And by the way, Rotary Clubs have grants. And I said, oh, they have grant sources. Interesting. Rotary Clubs, Lions Clubs, Kiwanis, local Masonic temples, local community foundations. I've just last year written or gotten funding from crowdfunding, Google Give Choose, and Give Choose is a crowdfunding one-day, 24-hour Facebook-based, funding source. You just write your goal vision for the project you have, and we got $2,000 in 24 hours with no work. It was like someone wrote a little blurb that was published, but we had to apply to be part of that funding source, crowdfunding source. You may or may not be familiar with family foundations. Family foundations is a good resource, but you need to know a family member that has a family foundation. So it's typically someone that has a family that has resources, and their foundations are specific, usually to a particular segment, specific type of project or program. Unless you know them and they believe in you, and they say, well, if you're doing this, I'll give you some of our family foundation money. How would you find out about family foundations? You're not going to Google them. You're not going to find them online. But your clergy might know about family foundations. The clergy of neighboring churches who buy into the ministry that you're doing and want to support you somehow. Your diocesan staff, your diocesan bishop might know about family foundations that are in the diocese. Again, family foundations don't typically announce their funding source anywhere. That is a real direct contact. Other local regional sources, if you're part of a deanery in your church geographic region, sometimes deaneries or regional churches pool some money for mission and outreach. Well, if your program is serving a mission and outreach purpose, request funds from them, and they might have a process for you to follow to get funds. Your diocese. Hey, many dioceses will say, we don't have any money, we don't have any money. And maybe that's true, but if all you need is $1,000, bishops have discretionary funds. Maybe you could get and apply for some funding to start your pilot program through your bishop. So always work with, in conjunction with your diocese, let them know what you're up to. Different people in the diocese as well. Banks. Your local banks tend to have community funds that they give out. You just need to apply for them. It might be a small amount. Typically, local banks give maybe $500 to $1,500, but it's a start. I would also interject here that when you're applying for any amount of funding, the grantor wants to know what are the sources that you are, other sources of funding that you have. And, you know, the more you have, even if it's small, the more they know that you are doing networking in your community, and it's helpful in your grant process. Local businesses. Sometimes local businesses have community funds. And last but not least, don't disregard your neighboring churches, Episcopal churches or other denominations. If it's something that's unique for the people of God and you sell it with a clear vision and purpose and with goals that you know are measurable and can be proven, you have a good shot at getting local clergy to perhaps help you with some grant funding. I would say with any granting source that you have to find the funding sources that matches your concept. So if a grantor funds material and rent, but not salaries, don't put salaries on your, narrative budget, because it's not something that they can fund. Or if you do include it, make sure that you're detailing to them what other source of funding is going to cover that which they do not fund, so that they're not saying, oh, these people didn't read our requirements, we don't fund salaries, and they put salaries in here. Well, stipulate salaries are coming from Bishop XYZ or from, Bank LMNOP. Be very clear on your budget, on your narrative budget. Here's another important thing, please don't invent materials that you need or want, or that you think they want to hear, I should say, that you would be using for a program if you're not going to use it. You cannot use funds for purposes that the grantor explicitly states they don't allow. That's fraud. So if they say we don't fund bricks and mortar, don't say, well, I'm going to buy paper and a copy machine with this, because that's fraud. Another don't that I would ask you to please be mindful is don't try, and how do I say this? Don't try to adapt your program or your project to the funder's requirements. Your concept should fit their funding requirements. Shouldn't be the other way around. Don't try to invent a program that you know would get funded by agency X, Y, or Z, because then it's likely that you don't have a target audience for those funds. Let's talk about diocesan sources. Who would you call in your diocese? Well, I talked about that just a minute ago, but let's break that down a little bit more. I would first speak with a development officer if there is one in your diocese. Some dioceses have congregational development officers. Give them a call. Sometimes it's the treasurer of your diocese. Once you know what funding sources they might know about, then you can speak to maybe the canon to the ordinary, and any one of your bishops. If you have one, if you have three, they are all networks. They all know people that might be able, they might all be able to point to people that you can use as either a sounding board or a funding source. You never know. So you can't be shy about asking. I will say again that it's important to ask them about endowed funds. All of those people would know about endowed funds if they exist in the diocese, in the diocesan funding sources. They might also point you to a church X, Y, or Z as well. You may want to email your concept to some of the people that you're going to talk to, so that when you speak to them or you make an appointment and you visit with them, they have a good idea of what you're trying to do. The more you explain it, the better you will be at in writing a grant and proving your concept. You have to repeat it to many people depending on how much funding you need. And then national sources. I'll name a list, and I've given you most of the links to these organizations. Each one of these organizations funds different types of ministries, different types of programs, different target audiences, different constituencies. You'll have to do the legwork. The United Thank Offering, Episcopal Church Women, the Episcopal Church Foundation, Mission Enterprise Zone grants, Jubilee Ministries, the Episcopal Church Building Fund. And then some dioceses have what's called mustard seed grants, and those are usually grants that you would receive to prove a concept, to launch a pilot program, a startup program or project. So you could explore at the national levels all of these different types of sources. I'll open up to questions and answers if I'm able to answer them.
So again, welcome everyone in Zoom to use the chat box for questions, or for the Q&A box as well, if that's more convenient for you. Click on the upper left-hand side of your screen and press that button for the chat or for the Q&A feature. And as well, a reminder to those who are joining us live on Facebook that you can also type in your comments or questions in there, and I will relay them to Daniel. I will give one quick clarification, though, that ECF has only one granting program, and that is our fellowship. So while there are definitely some great opportunities with the Fellowship Partners program, that is our one and single granting program. Jackie previously pointed out that perhaps we got the question a little bit backwards from our previous time we were taking questions about what are the common components, such as audience need, etc., in a grant application.
Common components would be mission, objective, vision, who you want to serve, that kind of question. Goals, very specific goals. They also want to know outcomes. Common components are going to be partners that you work with. Common components are usually all of your funding sources. They don't always like to see that you're relying on one funding source for your entire project. program, particularly if it's a program that's high cost. They would like to see every grant also requests and requires that you provide a budget. And you, a CPA or a business person, to write a budget, it's like the budget in your home. How much money comes in? How much money comes out? Hours a day in a program that's off a week, 3, 6 times 2 is 12, and they're paid $10, $120. You write that math in the narrative so they see how you came up with the number. So that's what a narrative budget would look like, and I've provided you with a narrative budget sample. So for the most part, those are common components, and the other common components would be references. So if it is your rector and a dean partner organization, they typically want references of people that that know you, know your church, know your program, and they do call them.
Great, thank you. Well, it looks like we can go ahead and move on to the next section.
Let's talk a little bit about logistics in writing the grant. Some grantors may request a pre-application or letter of inquiry. And that pre-application of letter of inquiry should be on a church letterhead. I'm speaking from a grants written on behalf of St. Gabriel's, for example. So it should be on church letterhead. It's official. They want to understand your idea, and they want to understand in perfect detail who you're serving, the who, how, who, what, when, where, why should be narrated succinctly in a pre-application or letter of inquiry. If you have, before you even apply for their grant, some of you to put, for example, I've been doing a literacy program at my church for the last year, and we are going to increase the number of people we serve and the days that we provide the literacy program, and we need that many more materials, that many more volunteers, that many more babysitters to pay, etc. And so you should be clear about why you're applying, why you wish to apply for the grant. And then after that, they might give you the invitation. Or a lot of these grants, when they're online, is I cut and paste the electronic. Sometimes it could take up to 1 week, 2 weeks. You don't want to lose the information you're writing. So I cut and paste the question, and if it says 500 words max, I'm on Word, and I'm making sure that I tweak my response to be under the limit, and then I have the option to go back to it so that I can edit. It's also a great way to, when you're doing an online grant application, flowing or the organization that you're appealing to. It will also help you to read the whole grant request in terms of the questions that they ask, and write them out. Make sure that you know what pieces, sort of like logistical. It might take you 2 weeks to get the information from your bookkeeper at church, and be very clear about what their deadline is. Don't miss a deadline. you won't be considered. And so if it says it's up to midnight on January 5th, well then midnight of January 5th it is. I wouldn't wait till midnight at January to do that. We're usually operating alone and we're the ones writing the grant. But if you have the opportunity, the time to send it days in advance, they might come this or is missing that. Please submit it, and they're giving you a chance to complete the application instead of just X you out. I've already said it, and I'll say it again. I've said it multiple times. The key to a successful grant is answering the question they ask. If you haven't written a grant before and don't have experience to help in writing one, as I said at the very beginning, use a small grant. Use a small grant, a $1,500 grant. Run through where you're going to ask for information. I find that when I write grants, and let's use our internet options, do some research that you can. So if it's local to your community, cite it. Use the website of the source of information you're using, just like you did when you wrote papers in college and in seminary, because that is backing up your data. It's backing up what you're saying about your community, for example, or the type of project that you're doing. Again, all that does is you are thorough, that you understand the community that you're serving and the project that you're writing to get funding for. So I'm not saying that if it's more is source them to prove what it is that you're trying to relay. It's important to know that grants take a lot more time than you would anticipate when you first start writing them. You say, oh, I could bang this out in 10 hours. The average grant, let's say a $5,000 grant, could be a 40-hour project. So it's
Daniel, we seem
just
to be
like a paper that you write, or a sermon that you write. You have to go with multiple times and be back and say, are you hearing me now?
No, we're having some real issues. Can you maybe close out some other applications or anything that might be slowing down?
Are you not hearing me, Brendan? All right. Let me see. Sorry about that. I don't. Hello.
Okay, much better.
All right. It actually closed out and started up all on its own. I don't know what you heard last. Can you hear me?
Still having some issues with that.
I'm sorry about that. No better now?
No.
Can you hear me? Whoa. I'm going to go out and come back in. I'm going to go out and come back in.
Sorry, everyone. Sometimes technology does not cooperate. Hopefully, we can get this fixed by having him do the reset mode of going in and going back out. In the meantime, I know we're getting closer to our time of wrapping up at 8 o'clock. So I'd encourage you, if you do have any questions, any pressing things that you wanted to make sure you got out of tonight's webinar, to please put those into the chat box. Or if you're joining us on Facebook, into the comment section, so we can be sure that Daniel has an opportunity to answer that for you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
No? Mm-hmm. Yes? We're good. We're back on. Are we on? I'm sorry about this. I don't know what's going on. My signal strength says everything's okay. Can you not hear me? Oh. Hmm. You're not hearing me, are you?
Okay, seems to have improved a little bit now.
All right. I don't know what you last heard. Actually, I think I was just talking and no one could hear me. So I'll just repeat some of what I said. And that is that if you haven't written a grant before and don't have experienced support, someone that's done it before to help you, you should be aware of the time that it takes to write a grant. And even a grant of like a $5,000 grant could be a 40-hour endeavor. So it's time consuming. The only way to learn how to write a grant is writing one. I've taken several grant writing classes over the years, and it's true. The only way to learn how to write a grant is writing one. So start small. Process. In the research, use your demographics, use tools. The Episcopal Church has some tools. Mission Insight is one of that. It gives, a demographic of the area around your church. I have also found that the demographics of the public schools are the most accurate, because every public school student, if you're writing a grant for children, every public school has to submit the demographics of the children in their school annually. And so that is a trusted source. Make sure that you describe the participants' needs very clearly, and be clear of who else might be providing a similar type project with the distinguishers of your own program while you're at it. Be clear to differentiate yourself. So when you're writing a grant, you don't want to be salesy, but you are selling your program to someone that you want to have it to fund it. So it's a fine line, and that's why you should have readers partner with you, read your grants. Budget. Typically, a grantor wants your organizational budget. As I said earlier, that would be your church's annual budget and a budget for the project or program you're applying for. You have to make sure in your budget that there's the last column on the right is a narrative, so that the funder sees how you arrived to your numbers. Letters of support can be from community partners, your bishops, even competitors, people that are doing the same kind of project or program elsewhere. Give yourself time before the deadline to have reviewers see your grant. and always follow up with the funder to ensure that they got your application, and if there's anything missing. And last but not least, pray and have other people pray with you for the grant that you are writing. Q&A, if there's any questions.
Thanks, Daniel. Yes, there is. We have one person asking, what about faith-based government grants? More specifically, are they worth pursuing?
You know, faith-based government grants typically require a lot of staffing to write them, to send reports to them. And if you aren't an organization, I would say a church with multiple staff people, if your project is if the need that you're trying to fund is like $100,000 or less, I wouldn't say that a government fund, even for faith-based organizations, is worth your time. It's a lot of paperwork, a lot of follow-up, a lot of reporting, and your organization might not be able to sustain it. The only, I wouldn't call it a government grant, but I once wrote a grant to the Boston Police for something called Holy Hip Hop. It was a program for incarcerated youth that were being reintegrated into society, into their communities. And that one was nothing like a government grant, in that they didn't have all of this paperwork requirement, paper trail that's required of government, even though it was sort of a pseudo-government, local government or organization. But their structure, the structure of the grant and what they required, wasn't going to kill us. I've served on boards that get federal funding and write grants, federal grants, and they have staff people, departments of staff people that are that monitor or work on the government grants and all of the reporting required by it. So for churches in the norm of our sizes, I would say that it's probably not the best source of funding for you.
Thank you. And again, if you do have any questions, please feel free to put those into the chat box or the Q&A feature. Or if on Facebook, you can put that into the comment section. As we're wrapping up, I would love to know, Daniel, if there is any sort of issues you've run into, or your experience with having to demystify Episcopal and our structures or in our terms or any language or things that you feel like that has tripped people up before in writing a grant.
No, you know, when the funder is looking at nonprofit organizations that have 501c3, you know, we are nonprofit organizations, and if they don't fund religious programs, you should not be applying for their funds. And they'd be very explicit in their requirements. We do not fund religious organizations, or we would not fund a youth group, or we do not fund a mission project, or we do not fund, you know, the building of your church. So they would be upfront about it. I've never had a problem or a need to explain what the Episcopal Church is, even if it's a secular organization.
That's helpful. Thank you. Well, we are just about at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. Thank you so much, Daniel, for all of this wonderful, wonderful information, this wealth of information. For those of you who would like to share this with others, we will make this recording available on ECF Vital Practices. We'll have an email sent out to you when that is available. Last but not least, you will be receiving very shortly in your inbox a link to a survey. So please go to your email, click on that link, and just take a couple of minutes to provide some feedback on this evening's webinar. We read through each and every single comment, and this will help us in planning future webinars, and we'll also provide that feedback to Daniel as well. Thank you all, and have a wonderful time in your grant writing adventures, and Godspeed in your mission and ministry.
Yeah, God bless you all. Bye.